Hi, everybody. How are you today? It is wonderful to be in Santa Fe, New Mexico. When I flew in last night, this marks the first time I've ever been to Santa Fe. I've only been to New Mexico one other time in my life. That was in August of 2017 when I was asked to give a talk on science and the Bible in Roswell. Um, so anyway, maybe that's where I got inspired to do the extraterrestrial stuff from. But I went there, and I'll just tell you a brief anecdote about that. I got to I said, so, do I fly to Roswell? And they said, no, you can't do that. You have to fly into Albuquerque or El Paso. So I said, oh, I'll fly into Albuquerque because I had watched Breaking Bad on TV. And so I wanted to actually go there. Plus, my sister told me about a restaurant called Mary and Tito's that I really needed to eat at. So anyway, so I went there, and I got there, and I went to the rental car place because I had to drive to Roswell. And they said, we're sorry, we're all out of economy cars. What they did have was a Mustang convertible. So I drove that Mustang convertible from Albuquerque to Roswell through the desert. And of course, I was listening to A Horse with No Name by America the whole way. So anyway, that's just about my last trip. But I really had a wonderful time today touring downtown. Quite beautiful. So thank you for welcoming me to this beautiful state and city. Tonight, I'm going to talk to you about God and the problem of evil, quite an appropriate discussion for Lent, and also a difficult one. A difficult one because no matter how many talks you could ever give, you'll certainly never satisfy all of the questions and perplexity that people encounter and experience when they suffer, right? However, that is the way it is, in a sense, both in theology and philosophy as well as in science. Explanations shed some light, but they also create new questions. Am I correct? Yeah. So brilliant insights deepen our understanding, but that deepening never resolves the mysteries at the heart of reality. In the words of the late Catholic nuclear physicist Peter Hodgson, in both science and faith, there is detailed knowledge that guides our lives, one in the natural world and the other in the supernatural world. And in each, there is a mystery at its heart. One great scientist who exemplifies this, was William Thomson, known to history as Lord Kelvin. Kelvin was one of the great pioneers of electrical theory, after whom the standard measurement of electrical current, the Kelvin balance, was named. As the story goes, he once made an anonymous tour of an electrical equipment factory in his native Britain, and Kelvin listened patiently to a young factory apprentice as the apprentice explained elementary facts about amps and volts. And when he was done, Kelvin asked him, "Please tell me what electricity is." And the young man fell into an awkward silence. Then Kelvin said, "Don't let that worry you. No one knows what electricity is." No one in his day understood electricity better than Kelvin, and yet Kelvin also humbly recognized that his understanding was only a glimpse, not unlimited comprehension. Theologians and philosophers, especially in the Catholic tradition, are not exempt from the humility that Kelvin showed. In fact, it is an even greater necessity for those contemplating the mysteries of faith and the absolute mystery of God. Consider St. Thomas Aquinas, the greatest theologian of the Middle Ages and perhaps of all church history, who at the end of his life had a remarkable spiritual experience while celebrating Mass on the feast of St. Nicholas in 1273, the year before his death. He abruptly stopped writing afterwards, and when a fellow friar urged him to continue his writing, he exclaimed, "Everything that I have written seems like straw compared to those things that I have seen and have been revealed to me." So given the examples of both Kelvin and Aquinas, it should not be surprising that as we approach the thorniest and most painful theological issue, the problem of evil, we must begin with humble recognitions of the limits of our understanding. I was delighted and honored to learn that some of you have been studying the book that I wrote. And in one of the chapters of that book, the third chapter, I explore God's relationship to his creation, celebrating the whole universe as a work of divine love. And yet the universe, life, human life, give evidence of imperfections that cause immeasurable suffering and death for God's creatures. The problem of evil seems to call into question that the universe is the product of divine love. And the suffering, the misery and destruction that we see all around leads some to reject the existence of God altogether. This is not a new problem, but modern science has made it more acute, has clarified it by helping us to understand the fragility not only of all life, but also of the universe. We know now that our very sun is destined to fizzle out, that the universe will expand until it whispers away. In terms of human evil, we now know a great more about human psychology, which shows that many of the worst tendencies we find in ourselves can seem almost hardwired into us: violence, greed, lust. How do we reconcile the doctrine of God the Creator, who creates in love, with the presence of evil in his creation? I'll try to approach this issue tonight in 3 steps. First, I will try to adequately define evil, relying on the thought of St. Augustine. And this will mean facing a paradox that we've already outlined, the paradox of divine creation and evil. Second, I will repeat and address one classic philosophical formulation of the problem, as many atheists adopt it today, and I'll attempt to reframe it in a way that offers the perspective of faith. And then finally, I will turn to the book of Job. And there we will see the divine answer to the problem of evil, which is not itself a solution, but something even greater, an encounter. So as we proceed again, let's adopt the humility of Calvin and Aquinas. In the use of our powers of reason, 2 conditions of darkness can and do occur. There are mysteries beyond us that show us reason's limits and contradictions below us that disturb and injure truth. Bad theology sets out to convince by offering simplistic solutions and hiding the deep contradictions that those superficial solutions rely on. Good theology, I propose, sets out in faith and is not surprised when it must say that no more can be said. The key to avoiding contradiction while embracing mystery is to know the power and the limits of human reason, to go only so far as in exploring as reason and reality permits, and to be willing to leave the rest to wonder and humble silence. So if I'm successful tonight, I will resolve some absurdities, some contradictions, but will preserve mystery. Because the real answer to the problem of evil is ineffable. It is hidden in the wounded heart of Christ, and it ultimately involves seeing the world through the lens of the wounds of Christ, or the lenses of the wounds of Christ. So, onward. As I've said, the problem of evil is immense. It touches all of creation. At the same time, the doctrine of creation out of nothing implicates God in the existence of all things. As the great Dominican theologian Herbert McCabe once said about the problem of evil, God committed the world and its evil, or rather, God committed the world and he openly admits it, right? And so all things, even our own thoughts and our free actions, are locked in a paradox. Both have God for their source, and yet also both have the capacity for evil. St. Paul, recognizing the imperfections of creation, speaks of the whole of creation groaning in pain. God, creator and source of existence for all things, made real the freedom of Mother Teresa as she gave herself to the poor of Calcutta, and he made real the freedom of the Nazi concentration camp guards. So we must face the question, how can we claim God as the source of all things when we find evil and suffering throughout creation? 1,500 years ago, St. Augustine asked this perhaps more poignantly than anyone in his Confessions, reflecting above all upon the evil that he found in himself. We now make his questions our own. Who made me? He wrote. Was it not my God who is not only good, but goodness itself? Whence came I then to will to do evil and to be unwilling to do good, that there might be cause for my just punishment? Who was it that put this in me and implanted in me the root of bitterness, seeing I was altogether made by my most sweet God? Where is evil then? And when did it start? And how has it crept into the world? What is its root and what is its seed? It was St. Augustine himself who would be perhaps the first in the history of philosophy to offer the clearer perspective on evil, which we often refer to now as the privation theory of evil. He saw that evil was not a being and therefore not a subsistent reality, not a thing that God created. Rather, evil is a lack or absence. It's the privation of a good that it is the nature of something to have. Notice I put something that they ought to have. That term is a little ambiguous, but I couldn't fit all of that onto the slide, sorry. Not all absences of good are evil. A rock is not able to see. It does not have the goodness of sight, but we do not feel compassion for a rock as we do for a person who suffers the loss of their sight, because it is not in the nature of a mineral to see. Every created nature is finite. Even if a creature has all that is natural to it, it doesn't have the infinite range of perfections that only belong to God, the source of all being, and goodness. It was precisely the realization of God as creator of all things that allowed Augustine to conclude that evil is not anything found in nature. His insight was formally proclaimed as a doctrine of the Catholic faith by the Council of Florence. This council asserts that there is no nature of evil, because every nature, insofar as it is a nature, is good. The evil that causes us to suffer and creation to groan is not a creature of God, not something willed positively into being by him. It exists precisely when a creature, or in the case of a human being, a thought, word, or action, lacks something that it ought to have by nature. God is not the source of evil, although he does permit it. The Catholic philosophical tradition following Augustine recognizes two categories of evil. The first kind is definitely the most elusive kind. Physical evil. Evil that doesn't involve personal fault, though personal fault is sometimes the cause of it. Okay? One of the difficulties here is that in our culture, we usually only use the word evil in reference to one kind of evil, moral evil. So when we talk about someone suffering a physical evil, it might be more easy to recognize the meaning if we said they suffer a misfortune, right? Some difficulty. Physical blindness, as I said, is an example. Blindness is the non-existence, the privation of sight in a creature whose nature it is to see. And this is an elusive category, because many physical evils occur as a matter of course because of physical goods. Cancer happens because mutations that drive evolution, which is good, also drive disease, which is evil. Underwater earthquakes that create tsunamis create human deaths and property destruction, which is evil. Because geological processes, which are good, that form beautiful tropical islands that are good deprive the Earth's crust of its stability, which causes evils for creatures whose lives depend on that stability. The same is true throughout all of biological life. As Aristotle keenly observed, the generation of new life requires corruption, which literally means destruction. The conception of a new human being requires the corruption of the ovum and sperm. They cease to exist when they combine to form the zygote. And in order to sustain their lives, animals destroy other living things by consuming them. Hence, the life of the spider, which is good, is the death of the fly, which is not good for the fly. Anytime we observe an example of physical evil and try to identify it, we discover that it is impossible to find evil until we come to some negative, to some absence. The purely positive properties of anything cannot be called evil, even if those positive properties are the cause of evil or implicated in evil. For example, a deadly virus consists of genetic material and a coating of protein. None of those positive components are evil. Indeed, all living things are made up of genetic material and proteins. The evil of a deadly virus is not any part of it. So what is it? It's the privation of health and life that it causes for other creatures that is the true evil. Consider that the very viruses that may cause sickness can also be directly involved in great good. For example, evolutionary biologists tell us that a retrovirus, a kind of virus that inserts its DNA into cells of other organisms, inserted its genetic material into the DNA of our evolutionary ancestors millions of years ago. What would normally have meant sickness and perhaps death became the genetic component for the mammalian placenta, upon which all human beings depend in the womb. Now, no evil can also be good and be a positive cause of goodness. That would be a contradiction. And so we come back to our point. The virus is not the evil. The absence of health and the negation of life it might cause. That is the true evil. The late Jesuit philosopher Norris Clark called evil a hole in being. It is the lack of that which would be present by nature, the non-existence of some good. The second and more tragic kind of evil Augustine identified is moral evil. The evil by which rational creatures knowingly and freely deprive their own thoughts, words, and actions of the good that ought to be present within them. And once again, it is the whole within these that make them evil, so to speak, speaking metaphorically. Adultery is an example. Its evil does not consist in the bodily pleasure or personal intimacy and sexual intercourse, both of which are goods as such. The evil of adultery is the non-existence of sexual fidelity, when sexual fidelity ought to be present. This lack of loving fidelity to a spouse corrupts the good of sex from within, rendering it an inherently immoral action. The evil of the crimes of the Nazis and the concentration camps involved the absence, in their thoughts, words, and deeds, of the proper respect for the human life and dignity of the Jewish people and the others that they imprisoned, tortured, and killed. The absence of that compassion is what made Auschwitz evil, not the concrete walls of the gas chambers or the gases used there for horrific purposes. If God is the source of all things that are, as he is wholly the source of causing even my own free choices to exist. Doesn't that implicate God in moral evil? St. Augustine has an answer. He notes that when we sin, God is the cause of our ability to will, but it is our defection from God that is the cause of the moral evil. We have the ability to choose from God, who creates us as free creatures. But in moral evil, we use it then to turn and embrace a void, impoverishing ourselves. Finally, and this is very important, to call evil a privation is not to declare it to be non-existent or powerless. It is a lack where something truly should be present by nature. And so it is always a privation in something real. Because of this, it is powerfully destructive, simply by virtue of what it takes away and disfigures. Physical and moral evil are the source of real suffering for human beings. And those who suffer from them, and is there anyone who doesn't, can rightly be called poor in some real way. Psalm 34, verse 7 tells us that the poor one cried out, and the Lord heard, and from all his distress saved him. So our next question is, if the Lord is the one who hears the cry of the poor, why must the poor cry out to him in the first place? We can now turn to this question. Why does God, the source of all things, create a universe in which physical evil actually is a part of its functioning and in which moral evil permeates human life? The classic argument proposed centuries ago by the English philosopher David Hume runs as follows. You may already be familiar with this from a philosophy class that you've taken yourself. God by nature must be both omnipotent and omnibenevolent. Now, if God is omnipotent, he could prevent all evil. And if he is all good, he would do so, since it is the characteristic of a good person to prevent evil whenever possible. But in fact, he does not prevent all evil, even though he could, but allows a vast amount of it, both physical and moral, as is evident in the world around us. Therefore, it follows that God is either not omnipotent nor omnibenevolent or omnibenevolent. In either case, such a being could not be God. Therefore, there is no God. It seems almost an insult to those who suffer in a world weighed down with evil to disagree with you, as if denying God's existence is a necessary part of showing compassion to the suffering. I would argue that denying the existence of ultimate goodness is no compassion at all. It seems almost an insult to some who suffer in a world weighed down with evil to disagree with you, as if denying God's existence is a necessary part of showing compassion to those who suffer. It might help to place Hume and his argument in a historical context. Hume was deeply influenced, as was really his entire period, by a mechanistic conception of the universe as a massive machine, an image that he shared with Sir Isaac Newton, who, by the way, had deeply influenced Hume's philosophy. And yet the great flaw of evil in this machine seems to him to undermine the idea of a divine machinist or inventor. He's looking for a God omnipotent and omniscient who creates a flawless machine. But our universe has massive flaws considered as a machine, namely the evils we suffer. And so for Hume, evil is proof that this machine has no divine engineer behind it. But engineers do not enter into personal relationships with their creations. They love them as products. They do not love them interpersonally. What if God created the universe for persons out of love? That changes the picture radically. As Joseph Ratzinger once wrote, a world created and willed on the risk of freedom and love is no longer just mathematics. As the arena of love, it is also the playground of freedom, and so incurs the risk of evil. It accepts the mystery of darkness for the sake of the greater light constituted by freedom and love. As for the universe, its integrity would simply be annihilated if God were to miraculously suspend the stable operation of the many forces and laws in the cosmos whenever necessary in order to prevent any physical evil. Given that stable operation on which the evolution of the universe and of life depends, it is inevitable that living organisms will occasionally act spontaneously or be acted upon in ways that bring them into conflict with that stable operation and cause them injury, with pain and suffering as a result. As I've already noted, most physical evils occur because of physical goods. Recall the geological processes that cause beautiful tropical islands and tsunamis. The lion could not be itself unless it killed and consumed the gazelle, which is good for the lion, but evil for the gazelle. Much of the beauty and majesty of our universe would be missing were God simply to halt every physical evil. That absence would also mean a universe in which life would not freely develop, in which everything would operate according to a single overwhelming pattern. That would translate into a world in which there would be nothing surprising in nature, and in which human beings could not choose to impose their own patterns on things. It would be a world without freedom. It would be a regimented world in which we could not have any meaningful activity of our own. That works if the universe is just a machine. It doesn't work if it was created by love and for love. So when we come to the greatest tragedy of all, the moral evil of human beings, we are faced with the same dilemma. There would be no human freedom in a world in which God prevented all moral evil. In such a universe, it would also be the case that human beings acting morally, with goodness in mind, could accomplish no good freely as real causes of goodness. God would not simply be the absolute source of all things. He would also prevent us from collaborating with him in the fulfillment of his desire to perfect the world he created, to make moral masterpieces of our own lives. The universe entirely belongs to God, but it would not belong to us as well, were there not freedom and the possibility for moral evil. If God enables us to freely cooperate, he must also enable us to freely choose to reject goodness. Moral evil must be allowed if moral goodness is to be possible. We do not want a divine dictator who would destroy our freedom. We want a heavenly Father who does not violate the universe and human freedom, a God who deals with us in love, not simply in power. Here we can define love as willing the good of another as other, for their own sake, and not for the sake of oneself. Pope Benedict XVI captured this point beautifully in his inaugural homily as Pope. By showing the unloving, the totalitarian lie behind the false promise of a universe with no possibility of evil. A lie that has been foisted upon human beings by ideologies of power, ideologies such as Nazism and Marxism. I'm going to take a quick sip before I read this long quote. One moment. He said in his homily, "It is not power, but love that redeems us. This is God's sign. He himself is love." How often we wish that God would show himself stronger, that he would strike decisively, defeating evil and creating a better world. All ideologies of power justify themselves in exactly this way. They justify the destruction of whatever would stand in the way of progress and the liberation of humanity. We suffer on account of God's patience, and yet we need his patience. God, who became a lamb, tells us that the world is saved by the crucified one, not by those who crucified him. The world is redeemed by the patience of God. It is destroyed by the impatience of men. Perhaps the Christian solution to Hume's argument lies precisely in the fact that God's work of creation and its fulfillment and redemption is not yet complete. God wills a perfect world, And he is actively working to bring the universe and history to its perfect fulfillment. In the words of 2 Peter chapter 3, verse 13, what we are waiting for is what the Lord promised, the new heavens and the new earth, the place where righteousness will be at home. From this perspective of faith, we can say to Hume, yes, God is all good and all powerful. And yes, evil is present in vast amounts. Therefore, God will defeat all evil. Indeed, he is already powerfully and mysteriously doing so by enabling his creatures to be themselves, mercifully forgiving them when they fail, working through holy men and women to transform the world through their free cooperation with him. God would not allow any evil unless he could bring some greater good from it. In other words, the answer to Hume's puzzle is the theological virtue of hope. Hope is what we have when we know and are confident that there is a meaning, but that meaning is not yet fathomable to us. This free cooperation and transformation of the universe does not come simply from good intentions shared among a few. It comes from the loving sacrifice that God took upon himself when he became a human being in order to accomplish our liberation from evil, sin, and death. The ultimate answer that God gives to our questions about evil is the life, death, and resurrection of Christ, which we annually celebrate in this Lenten and then Easter season. First, in his life, Christ overcame moral evil in himself by being the perfect example of the fullness of human goodness without any taint of sin whatsoever. In the words of sacred scripture, Jesus, the high priest who offered himself in sacrifice for our sins, is, and I'm quoting Hebrews, not unable to sympathize with our weaknesses, but in every respect has been tempted as we are, yet without sin. Second, in his sacrifice on the cross, Christ overcame moral evil not only in himself, but in all human beings, past, present, and future, by becoming an inexhaustible source of forgiveness to those who have sinned and the one who reconciles all human beings to God and to each other. And finally, through the miracle of his resurrection, Christ overcomes all physical evil. He takes our human nature into an indestructible life, preparing the coming of a new creation, a new heavens and earth with no evil whatsoever. This is why St. Paul calls the risen Christ the firstborn of many brothers and sisters, because he offers us the way to join him, body and soul, in a universe to come that is perfectly fulfilled and transformed into the kingdom of God. This is why after the consecration at Mass, when Christ is truly present, body, blood, soul, and divinity, we sing, "Save us, Savior of the world, for by your cross and resurrection you have set us free. By his cross, all moral evil is overcome. By his resurrection, all physical evil is put to an end." Christians do not deny the existence of evil. We are not naive optimists. In fact, we see it for what it is, a hole in God's good creation. Science is put to the task of finding solutions to various evils, and it has greatly improved human life through various means: medical therapies, agricultural innovations, technological advancements. These are all rightly celebrated as progress and as God's providential will for his human creatures. But evil will always be present in the world until it is fulfilled. And the way to overcome it fully is to walk daily with Christ crucified and risen through life, to walk with him as we did tonight in the Stations of the Cross before the Mass, the Gold Mass. This means being willing to suffer patiently out of love, recognizing that one's suffering is precious to God, not because he wishes us to suffer, but because such love is his own attitude to our universe, a love that overcomes all evil. Through loving God and loving like God, our suffering in the face of evil is transformed into sacrifice. sacrifice, which is not misery, but a joy-filled hope that in response to the cry of the poor, the Lord will wipe every tear from their eyes, and there shall be no more death or mourning, wailing or pain, in the new creation where God will be all in all. This analysis, while hopefully illuminating, is also terribly incomplete. It's easily interpreted and sometimes feels to those who hear it as a way of trying to get God off the hook. But the pastoral response to evil cannot be a matter of analysis, which I've done so far, but accompaniment. Therefore, I want to briefly consider the example of Job's encounter with God, where we see that God's own answer to evil is not a matter of analysis, but of encounter, of calling the sufferer into communion with himself. From any perspective other than that one of loving encounter, Hume's argument can seem invincible. But Hume's argument also makes suffering something that happens out there, in a sense, and leaves the questions of one's personal experience of suffering in the dark. It's only when we step into an encounter with God in suffering that we can move from despair to hope. And that first movement has to do with trust. Most of you are already familiar with the story of Job, the one from whom God takes everything, and then engages in long debates with three friends who try to tell him why he's suffering. Basically, that he must have sinned in some way and God is punishing him. Job rejects their accusations. They also tell him not to challenge God, but he does so throughout. Job charges God with vicious and unprovoked assaults. He cries out for vindication. God has afflicted him unjustly. And in the end, God does not agree with Job's friends. In fact, he tells the friends of Job, the ones who kept telling him not to challenge God, to fess up to what he had done, to get punished this way. God says that they, not Job, were the ones who had not spoken rightly. Only Job had. And then he tells them, startlingly, that they ought to get Job to pray for them. And after the Lord had spoken these words to Job, the Lord said to Eliphaz the Temanite, "My anger blazes against you and your two friends. You have not spoken rightly concerning me, as has my servant Job. So now take 7 bulls and 7 rams and go to my servant Job and sacrifice a burnt offering for yourselves. And let my servant Job pray for you. To him I will show favor and not punish your folly, for you have not spoken rightly concerning me, as he has." Wow. Throughout the story, Job complains. He cries out to God, his torment. He even wishes that he could stand before God at his seat so he could tell him exactly how he feels about his suffering. Throughout the story, we're also told that Job is really without fault, and he himself makes that point again and again to his friends, who are convinced that he's lying to himself, that he must have some secret evil that God is punishing. They have something, his friends, that's really not trust. It's just a kind of resignation. But from God's perspective, given at the end of the story, the truly righteous one, the one who will not turn away from God, will not curse God and die, as his wife recommends, is questioning, lamenting, angry Job. Job shows us that trust means not denying one's pain, not refusing to express it, but to turn it to God, to show it to him. In fact, one simple way to think about what Christian prayer is in response to God's revelation of himself to us, we reveal ourselves to him, right? And if within us there's suffering, pain, and anger, right, it's not the wrong idea to tell him that too. Pope Benedict XVI modeled this during his visit to Auschwitz in 2006, shortly after his papacy began. After walking under the lie, "Work will make you free," it still stands there. He said, in a place like this, words fail. In the end, there can only be a dread silence, a silence which is itself a heartfelt cry to God. Why, Lord, did you remain silent? How could you tolerate all this? Now, the text does tell us, returning to Job, that Job repents of what he said. So why does he repent? As it seems as if something about God's reply to Job opens up a new way for him to think and respond. God's reply is 3 long chapters. And throughout it, we see parental imagery. God swaddles the sea after giving birth to it from a womb. He also talks to it like a parent might talk to a rambunctious child. He hunts for the lions. He gives donkeys a home. He responds to Leviathan, the great crocodile's grunting, growling, and hissing, with tender words. In fact, he hears Leviathan's grunting, growling, and hissing as words, as tender words spoken to him. God's speech suggests that God's relationship to all of his creatures is personal, intimate, parental, even maternal. Now, a good mother will sometimes allow the children she loves to suffer, but only in the case that the suffering benefits the child who experiences it and benefits him in some way which couldn't have been equally well achieved without the suffering. A good mother, for example, wouldn't cause suffering to an innocent child for the sole purpose of making her husband learn a lesson. In the divine speeches, God is portrayed as giving the animals what they need because they need it. Food for the baby birds who cry to him, prey for the young lions. And so there is not a claim, but a suggestion, a picture, a portrayal that leads us to think that God operates on the principle of loving parenthood. The benefit which justifies a mother in allowing some suffering to an innocent child of hers has to go to the child. If she let her child suffer for someone else's sake or for some abstract general good, to that extent, she wouldn't be a good mother. If God is perfect, perfect love, if God deals parentally even with the inanimate parts of his creation, if he seeks to produce good even for the infant ravens, then in his dealing with human beings, with Job specifically, God is operating in the same way. If an innocent person suffers, then it will be because a good God, a loving God involved face to face with his creatures, produces or will produce out of the suffering a good meant for that person, which in the circumstances couldn't have been produced or produced as well without suffering. Love is not simply willing the good of another for their own sake. It's also a desire for union with the beloved, to be with the beloved. Let's consider the case of Job again. Job references it in his last words to God. I had heard of you by word of mouth, but now my eye has seen you. Therefore I disown what I have said and repent in dust and ashes. Job isn't repenting because he's afraid of God's power. Rather, he has seen God with him. Job's history had been a history of trust in God and obedience to God. He protests against God in the dialogues because he feels his trust betrayed. But for that charge, for that sense of betrayal, it is the face-to-face encounter which changes everything for Job. To answer a mistaken charge or betrayal, a person who loves you can try to explain, or she can just face you and let you see her. Job sees the face of God who loves him as a mother loves her children, and then he knows that he is encompassed by that love also. Job wanted bare justice, but his face-to-face experience with God goes past justice to love. And now his suffering has meaning, even if he's never told exactly what that meaning might be. In the words of Viktor Frankl, suffering ceases to be suffering at the moment it finds a meaning. Christian suffering is very often us finding that meaning, but realizing that it is hidden in the heart of God. Couldn't God have given Job meaning without suffering? Here is where we can realize that suffering can bring some goods that are impossible without suffering. Vulnerability, understanding, empathy. In the words of the French theologian Leon Bois, there are places in the heart which do not yet exist. Suffering has to enter in for them to come to be. Or as St. John Paul II said, suffering is present in the world in order to release love. So as we come to a conclusion, we can say that the pastoral and personal responses to human suffering in the face of evil become clear in God's response to Job. The pastoral response is loving accompaniment, in which of the good of the person is willed and a sharing of self with the person is offered, which allows a union with them. The personal response, my response to the evils I face, is trust in the love of God, for God has in some way allowed the suffering that I face, and in that way, and maybe in that way only, can be said to have permitted it. It is also, as we see in Job, even sharing with God our sense of abandonment, of feelings of betrayal, of feeling lost, which the suffering brings about. In both cases, God is permitted to cause goodness where goodness is absent, to bring good things forth from the privation, the nothingness of evil. In this way, the message of creation out of nothing resounds, even within the aching absences caused by suffering. Thank you very much. Do you have time for questions?
Any questions?
I'd be happy to take questions. Sure.
Questions?
It's not a question, but a comment.
Sure.
Thank you, this is excellent.
Thank you.
Also, put many things together in my mind. I love our Catholic faith, and I'm reading now about Saint Catherine of Siena.
Mhm.
You know, there are many saints throughout history who recognized evil in those who whose lives were going down the tubes. So their efforts to try to turn things around. So that was like they were trying to mediate or
Mhm.
yes, reintroduce this absence that we had in order for good.
Yes.
Time and time again, so many saints, Saint Monica and Saint Augustine,
Mhm.
you know, it seems that that turned that around, but you're right, it's absence.
Yeah.
You know, not that, like, God is not allowing evil, but, you know, it's.
Yeah.
The absence, that makes a lot of sense to me, so I just wanted to comment.
No, thank you. Yeah. You know, as a personal anecdote, I wouldn't be standing before you today or doing any faith and science work of any significance whatsoever had it not been for becoming a refugee with my young family after Hurricane Katrina. I was asked to do the event after I found out that the college where I taught was probably going to close perhaps forever. And I said yes to it because I didn't know what I was going to be doing with my time to help support my family. Okay. But the interesting thing about that was something that happened after we were all ultimately able to return. The college did open again. One of my colleagues, we had a listening session. People were talking about their experiences. Many of the people at that time, this was just 7 months after the storm, were still displaced. They were living in FEMA trailers, or they were living, some of them were living at the college in some of the empty dorms that the sisters had there before. And we had a kind of listening sessions. The Department of Psychology provided that for us. And I went to one, and I was sitting with my good friend, who was an education professor and also the mother of one of my theology majors. And she was talking about her own experience. She was crying. And she said, you know, I got so angry when I saw these people acting helplessly in the city, and CNN and Fox News and all these different, and then we could see all this. And it's like, it just made me so frustrated. She said, and then I saw a white woman with a young child. And then I realized, right? And that for her, there was this prejudice that the suffering had kind of shaken loose, right? I do think that it's true that if suffering can purify us, it can expand our hearts and make us love more deeply. So that was certainly a saintly moment for her.
Great.
Yes.
So how do you reconcile the existence of Satan or the devil?
With an all good God?
Yeah,
Sure. Well, actually, that one is no more difficult than reconciling the existence of Hitler or a serial killer with all good God. What you have is a good creature abusing its freedom, a creature whose power surpasses our own, right? And therefore is able to wreak a great more evil than any serial killer or even Hitler could ever do, right? But insofar as Satan exists, that's a good, right? Remember, he's a fallen angel, right? Yeah, so. Yes. Ma'am in the back?
Start, I was troubled a little by the title right before, and then evil is no evil and poverty were equal. And I was waiting for you to kind of get into that, and you sort of did in the middle of the talk. But we're not really saying that poverty is evil. We're talking about suffering is evil, right?
Sure.
Because now Jesus, well, I know in the Old Testament was a little bit different attitude toward poverty, but in the New Testament, Jesus really makes it seem as though the poor are elevated.
Blessed are the poor. Yes. Right.
And that they have, they're lucky.
Yeah. Well, that in itself probably could have been included in my presentation. Right? The poor are those who, in their poverty and the suffering that that involves, have a certain purification that occurs, right? In which they themselves are drawn closer to God and are given opportunities to love more radical sometimes than the ones who are not poor experience. Like, for instance, the poor widow, right? That Jesus praises for giving all she has in the offering, right? Yeah, so yeah, but one point that I hope came across in the middle there too, is that in some sense, we're all poor, right? From some perspective, and in some way, all of us suffer, right? So yeah, so it wasn't just about the economical poor, it would be about anyone who, in fact, experiences privation. Sir.
Slide right behind you, Pope Benedict.
Yes.
He asked you a rhetorical question that he understands how this happened, but he's really asking why did you remain silent, God? Why did you tolerate this?
Yeah.
Was that rhetorical, or was he asking as a real question?
I think this came from his own experience of anguish in the presence of this. Right? That it was his spontaneous cry to God on behalf of those who suffered and who lost their lives. I don't think it was a rhetorical device at all. I do think that, and he has many penetrating analyses and discussions of evil, right? There's a collection, by the way, one of the best places I've seen him do that is in his book, The Triune God. Meditations on the Triune God, or that might be the title of just The Triune God. Is a really good place to look at how he talks about this, right? Interestingly, he says there that most often it's people who are afraid of suffering that feel perplexed by suffering. He says the people who actually suffer, right, oftentimes don't feel like they need to question what their experience is. It's a very interesting analysis. But I do think that this was heartfelt, right? It's not, though, the cry of faithlessness, even though it could be misinterpreted that way, right? It's not an act of rejection. What it is someone who believes in the God of love, who is love, right? And the incongruity with what he's experiencing. what he sees in this particular place and what happened there, the history of that place. And one of the things I hope also came through the talk is that it's okay for us to approach, right, it that way. God would rather us not hide our feelings from him, right? When we are ripped apart like Job was, it's okay to cry out like Job did, right? One of the blessings of the church is our continuous praying of the Psalms. We pray the Psalms of praise, but we also pray the Psalms of lament, right? And sometimes we can almost pray them in the first person, considering our circumstance. Other times, we can pray them for those around us whom we know are suffering beyond what we are. Yeah. Is that helpful?
Yes.
Okay, great. Yes.
Something that came to my mind as you were going through the whole thing and summing things up was a phrase that we used to hear as children growing up
Mhm.
about suffering
Yes.
and sacrifice. Offer it up.
Yes.
And I remember as a child not understanding that really, really well.
Yeah.
And I think I came away from this understanding that more.
Right.
So I.
Oh, good. Oh, thanks be to God for that. Yeah. Yeah, my grandmother used to tell me to offer it up. And she had a right to. She had a lot of suffering in her life. So when she would tell me to offer it up, I wouldn't talk back. My mother, on the other hand, I kind of got lippy, but you know, so,
Good question for Friday of Lent.
yes, indeed. Other questions?
Maybe time
Yes.
for one more question.
And I can see that there has been some good that came out of Auschwitz, because now it's a universal symbol for most people, for what is not acceptable.
Yes.
I mean, people all over the world who can accept abortion and late term abortion and all of
Yeah.
that, still would never agree that Auschwitz was acceptable.
Absolutely.
And so it does become very popular. And a lot of it is
Right. Yes. Yes, God brings good out of evil. For sure. I do.
Invite him back for another talk.
There you go. Absolutely.
He has another talk tomorrow morning, so why don't we let the speaker go for tonight? Thank you all for coming. Thank you.
Thanks so much for coming. Look, a scientist from Los Alamos brought me here and he put this glowing red thing in front of me. So if y'all see me going through the parking lot and I'm glowing, just tell me.
I can't tell you what it is.
Okay. See you later.